Thank you very much for being here today. We're glad to have all you friends of the Goldman School. We thank you very much for joining the board, who has been meeting all afternoon. And we're also welcoming a number of graduates, alumni of the school, faculty, staff, friends, and the like. Before we continue with our program, however, Dean Brady would like to speak on behalf of Goldman School's very good friend whom we lost this week, and then we'll continue with our program in just a second.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few words about Richard Goldman. One of the great things about becoming dean in the last year and a half is that I got a chance to know Richard, and it was an amazing opportunity. He had steely blue eyes, and he was a no-nonsense kind of guy who, as one of my staff members said, always wanted to kick the tires, and so it was me that was having his tires kicked when I used to have lunch with him. But it was a wonderful experience, and I just learned a lot by hearing him as he tried to get a grasp on what the Goldman School was now doing, why it might make sense for him to add to his philanthropy, as he did for us in a very generous way, and just got a sense of how important it was for him to do two things. First, as he put it to me one day, he said, you know, my wife and I talked a lot about our wealth and what we wanted to do with it. And it was important to us that we do good in the world with the wealth that we were blessed with, and that we would make the world a better place. And that was an extraordinary thing. And then the second thing is, it was also very important to Richard that if he was going to give away his wealth, that it be used in ways that actually achieved the purposes that he wanted it to achieve. And that was, as I say, to do good in the world. So he really put you through a series of questions, an inquiry, an inquisition, if you will, to try to find out exactly how the money was going to be used, what you were going to be doing with it, and how you would achieve the end that he wanted you to achieve, which was to make the world a better place. And that's, I think, admirable traits, extraordinarily admirable traits. He gave away $500 million, which is an extraordinary amount of money, and we were lucky to have a piece of that. We would not have the magnificent buildings we have today. We would not have the amount of financial aid we have for students. We would not have a lot of the things we have without the money that Richard and his foundation and his wife gave us. It's a foundational set of gifts. He gave us another $5 million just a year ago. This money right now, believe me, is extraordinarily important as we hit hard times. It makes me sleep easier at night to know that I have that money in the bank, as it were, so that we can do a lot of the things we want to continue to do. So getting to know Richard was an extraordinary experience, and I really feel like we've lost a very great man. Obviously, the Goldman Environmental Prizes are an extraordinary accomplishment, awarding prizes to people who are public policy, environmental entrepreneurs, just the kind of people we hope our students will be, and what they are actually in many cases, doing amazing things entrepreneurially in the public sector. Those prizes pick out people who would surely have done what they did without the prize, but who deserve the recognition that they get because they've done such amazing things, many of them at great risks to their life. If you hear the stories of the people who win those prizes, they are amazing people. So there's a common stream through all of this, which is supporting the Goldman School of Public Policy to help train people who will go on to be policy entrepreneurs and who will make the world a better place. The environmental prizes, which award prizes to people who have already made the world a much better place. And in general, to support making the world a place that we can all be proud of. And I think the great challenge for us now, in the wake of his passing away, is to live up to the faith that he placed in us at the Goldman School, that we would indeed make the world much better. So talk about this at your tables, about how do we make the world a better place? What can we concretely do? I think that's important. So he will be greatly, greatly missed. I also just want to note that we have a distinguished visitor. We have a lot of distinguished visitors here, but one who came an especially long way. Gan Shijun, there, wave, okay, is the Director General of the Department of Social Development at China's Ministry of Science and Technology. He has managed national programs on the environment, population, and natural resources. He was involved in early Chinese climate change national policy and international negotiations. He met with the U.S. team led by Vice President Al Gore during the 90s to discuss bilateral strategies related to global climate change. He later on was appointed chairman and CEO of China National Publishing Import and Export Corporation, and he's now retired from those positions, but remains vice president of the Chinese Society for Sustainable Development and is a board member of the Sino-U.S. Center for Sustainable Development. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here tonight. And I should note, Gan Shijun's son, Ganbai, works for us in our executive education program, and it's thrilling to have Ganbai with us as well. Please have a nice dinner, and we'll come back to you a little later with our program. Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay. Dean Brady, thanks very much for those. Very nice. But you can eat and listen, or not listen, as you like. But thank you for those important words about Mr. Goldman. Okay. You can go ahead and eat. Although he's unable to attend tonight, I wanted to thank our board member, Dr. John DeLuca, for selecting and donating the wines that we have with us this evening. We are consistently, basically every board meeting and every dinner like this, he donates these wines, and we're very grateful for his generosity. We had, as I mentioned before, we had a board meeting this afternoon, and at it, Dean Brady, we discussed with Dean Brady basically recent independent evaluation of the school by an external review committee. And this committee was basically staffed by some very distinguished scholars from peer schools such as Harvard and Duke. And these peer institutions and their representatives came away lauding the Goldman School for its practices, for its education, for its students, and the like, and gave us what has to be one of the highest possible affirmations of our strengths. Basically, one of the principal recommendations is that we grow the school, we grow the faculty, we grow the students, and the programs. You don't see this kind of recommendation for expansion from every review, certainly not from such distinguished peer reviews. We weren't surprised at all by the highly positive statements, one of which, just to give you a flavor, was, and I quote, "The Goldman School has long been and remains the best in the nation." I believe that you probably are not, I think that's, I presume that you're not surprised by this either, and the board hopes that you share our excitement by this recognition. We're certainly gratified. Certainly, if you read the newspapers, and I would expect of any group of people, any sample group of people, you certainly would. You're quickly reminded of the importance of having schools like the Goldman School around. Our graduates and our faculty do absolutely preeminent research, and they have made a real impact on real-world policy issues over the course of time, and I think it goes back some 40 years now. So we thank you very much for being here and for your loyalty to the school, and we'll let you eat in peace for at least a little while longer. Thank you.
I'm really pleased to, this is the student speaker part of our program. As you know, we have exceptional students, really extraordinary people, all of them. I mean, they're really amazing, and it's such a thrill to have them around and talk to them every day. And as you may know, too, my office is right off the living room, so that in fact every day I have a gaggle of students right outside my door, often blocking my door, but that means I get a great chance to interact with them as I ask them to move their stuff and so forth. But they're really wonderful. They're really wonderful. They're tremendously interesting. So tonight we have a student who proves what is true, which is it takes more than exceptional grades, test scores, and overall academic achievement to be accepted into the Goldman School. In fact, our average student has 3 years of experience. Teal Brown's experiences are very, very interesting. Teal, well, first, she's a martial arts expert, so I've got to make sure I get this right. Okay, what kind of martial arts? Is it this kind of stuff?
It's that kind of stuff.
This kind of stuff, okay. So if she starts moving towards me, please just, sort of whisper something so I can hear and I know that I can protect myself, like that. Teal's, she's been associate at the prestigious Aspen Institute, been the deputy finance director at a Nebraska congressional campaign, worked at the United Nations Foundation, and volunteered for a women's cooperative lending group. But that's not all. She's a member of Screen Actors Guild, and she was in American Dreams, where you played what role?
Actually, a UC Berkeley student.
She played.
I hadn't told you that.
Was this is before you came?
Before life imitated.
So she had to come to Berkeley because she had played a UC Berkeley student, and she still does that extremely well. So I'm really pleased to introduce Teal Brown, Masters of Public Policy candidate in the class of 2011, Teal.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here among this distinguished group of people. And thank you, Dean Brady. I never thought that you would introduce me to anyone, let alone this group of people. So thank you. Yes, I was the role for which I received my Screen Actors Guild Award. I only realized this, union membership, not award, but it felt like that, I only realized this yesterday. I was actually playing the role of a UC Berkeley student trying to convince a bunch of Vietnam War protesters to come west and join UC Berkeley. So life imitates art. First of all, before I delve into what it's like to be a student at UC Berkeley at the Goldman School of Public Policy today, I'd like to say that I am a member of the Graduate Speaker Selection Committee for the 2011 class. And I am honored to be a part of that group. It's exciting, it's interesting, it's laborious, and it's time-consuming, and I'm kind of busy. So what I thought we could do is if everyone who would like to be the speaker could raise their hand, and then we'll have an efficient solution, we'll cut costs, it'll be great. No? Okay.
But Teal, you should ask if anybody knows Barbara Boxer.
Oh yes, does anyone know Barbara Boxer?
Because we're trying to get her as the speaker.
Excellent, I'm taking names. I will come and ask you.
Please, help us.
Great idea, perfect. Oh, and I'm sitting right there. Excellent, thank you. So before I came to Berkeley, I came from Oakland, where I graduated from high school a little over a decade ago, but I took the long way. I came via Vienna, Austria, Budapest, Hungary, northern Minnesota, Dakar, Senegal, western Nebraska, Los Angeles, and Aspen, Colorado. And so in my pre-Goldman tenure, I saw a remarkable range of wealth. I saw people living lives where struggle, hunger, and loss were a kind of daily bread. In the US alone, I saw homes in rural Nebraska with once white picket fences, and you would walk around the side of the house, and the fence would just stop. It just stopped. And there were the plains of the middle of our country, unfarmed, unwatered, abandoned, and dusty. And in Colorado, I saw the kind of wealth that can become game-changing glamour aid and fifth home extravagance. And so I learned something. You can stop a man from being broke, you can. You can give him cash. And you can even incentivize certain behaviors through that cash, but that won't stop him from being poor. To climb out of poverty, he needs a ladder. And at present, we have a ladder that has one rung, maybe two rungs, but it is not a ladder that is ready to be climbed. And so like many of you, perhaps all of you, I had seen this inequity and I thought, okay, it's probably my responsibility to help build this ladder. And so I came to Berkeley. I came to the Goldman School. And an interesting piece of my coming here was that it was the only place where I wasn't offered any finances. But I came here, and I came here for good reasons. I came here for 4 specific reasons, because this is where people are completely motivated to change the world, as Dean Brady said earlier. And this was also my assumption given the university's history. Because I would get skills to assess the policies that interest me most. And at the Goldman School, we call this a generalist education. Because it is highly ranked and has prominent faculty, and because I would have access to the mountains. Now, importantly, these are not only my reasons. These are the reasons of many of my peers. And they may have said things like the water or San Francisco, and I said the mountains. But the fact remains. This summer, I had the opportunity to serve on a small panel of students. There were about 5 or 6 of us who spent the summer culling through a survey of the 2011 graduating class. These 4 reasons were repeated throughout. My peers came here for a generalist education, to experience the legacy of UC Berkeley, to access our professors and prestige, and to be in a beautiful place. And when I arrived, I was greeted by a student body with 2 defining qualities. First, an extraordinary determination to change the world. And second, a completely astonishing belief that they were capable of doing this. And this was perfectly fitting, because Berkeley, Goldman, is where we come to speak truth to power. And Berkeley is the place where ideas meet action and the threshold of possibility is pushed a teeny bit further forward. And that's what we came here to do. It's the motto of our school. And so to be surrounded by such unflagging effort to provide sustainable solutions is thrilling. It's really thrilling. And I think that this level of commitment is unique to Goldman. So now I'm here, and I'm pursuing this master of public policy, and everywhere I go, people say things to me like, what's public policy? What is it you're studying exactly in public, what? And so I think that public policy is when we notice a failure, we recognize a problem, and we try to fix it. And so public policy school is where we get the famed tool belt that we talk about at the Goldman School to approach these problems and become a part of the solution. So if indeed public policy is the pursuit of solutions, then I believe the Goldman School has the opportunity to grow. I recently visited a professor to ask about a class he teaches in the spring that I would like to take. I'm particularly interested in gender and climate and developing countries, how we can uplift women and empower them to be a part of the solution toward adapting to and mitigating climate change. And he is a leading voice in this area. He actually has an efficient cook stove on his desk. And so I said to him, I'd like to take your class this spring, and he said, I'm not sure you have the quantitative skills required. And now, to be fair, he might be right. I may not be up to snuff, but my experience at the Goldman School should carry some clout. And were he more familiar with the Goldman School, perhaps he would be more excited to have someone with my skill set in problem solving be a part of his conversation. So perhaps the Goldman School could serve as a place for campus-wide, solution-based approaches to big, intractable problems. Maybe we can position ourselves as a program with strong quantitative problem-solving skills and as the location for interdisciplinary conversations that cross department boundaries. Today, we are students at a university with a legacy of pushing big, important social change, a visionary place. We have Nobel laureates, elected officials, leaders in multilateral and international institutions, former cabinet members, people who are at the crux of problem solving in their disciplines all over the world and here in the Bay Area. And this whole place is experiencing tight budgets and decreasing money. As students, believe me, we're aware of this. So we have to learn how to be more efficient with our time and how to better allocate our resources. And here, all around us, are the resources of UC Berkeley. And I think that there's a place for Goldman to position itself as the nexus for engagement on interdisciplinary conversations and collaboration toward progress on real public policy issues. One thing I've experienced here is this increasing realization of just how huge this place is. You get here, and you go through your first year, and then you enter your second year, and all I can think, And so many of the conversations I have are things like, I didn't even know that building was there. Or they have an entire department dedicated to medieval Icelandic, which is actually true. My uncle is an alum. And now I'm about to be spit out into the world. And I feel like I've barely scratched the surface of what this place could be for me. But in our time here, 15 months, my fellow students, John, Seth, and Sarah, worked with the law school to help put legislation on the California ballot. Ari and Disha have worked with engineers to launch a program in rural India which will give hundreds of people access to water and allow them to keep their jobs. Iman, Paul, and Victoria worked with the Education Policy School to help restructure the Oakland school systems. And Cassandra, Brian, and Greg provided such insightful recommendations to the California Public Utilities Commission that they were taken all over the state to provide their recommendations this summer, and some of them may be implemented. And this is just a few of my peers, and this is just in our short time. What if integration and collaboration were a part of the very fabric of the school? Has anyone heard of Yelp, the website? So what about Yelp Cal, or maybe we call it Roar? And we formalize the process of mapping the academic experience for the GSPP student by creating a website that groups classes, lectures, programs by topic area, and allows students to provide feedback and comment and rate. At present, we have an Excel sheet. It's transferred generation to generation between the students, and it's cumbersome, and it's out of date, and it's often incorrect. Or what about student labs, where once a week you email out a paper or just a big, crazy idea, and people come together to talk about it, to critique and have conversation. And you join the email list for these labs because you're interested in the topic. And so you come not because you're in public policy school, but because you're interested in crime or gender or ecology. At present, I belong to 5 groups dealing with development and climate. These are housed within the ag resource economics, environmental health sciences, energy and resources, health policy, business, and public policy schools. And these are highly disciplinary groups. In these groups, I'm an outlier. What if there were more outliers, more big picture thinkers with varied skill sets? Maybe these groups would have larger, longer lasting impact. So perhaps there's room for Goldman to position itself as a gathering place for all of these various groups to come together. Maybe we could take all of this stuff, all of this incredible breadth of theoretical knowledge here at Cal, and focus it on a solution-driven model housed at the public policy school. We are a young field, and so there is room for ideas and innovation, but fortunately, ideas and innovation are core tools of public policy. The dean and the Goldman administration have been transparent and accessible, remarkably so, as they think through the future of the Goldman School. And I do think there's a real prospect for plans to include a more robust presence within the broader university, and I hear this echoed by my classmates. At the heart of it, what we're talking about is a place with the kind of drive for social justice and the kind of dedicated work ethic that, in my humble opinion, is unmatched. Go Bears. But it is also a place that needs your continued guidance to remain at the very top of its game. I'm truly honored to be standing here before this accomplished and dedicated group of people. It is through your efforts and work that the Goldman School continues to be what it is, and it is through your thoughtfulness that it will become better and better. I wish you could see the men and women I go to school with standing here with me. There is no way that I could do them justice. And it's pretty cool to think what I, astonishingly enough, believe we will go on to accomplish. I'm grateful to be part of such an important institution. And when I leave here this May, I'll be proud to consider not just UC Berkeley, but specifically the Goldman School of Public Policy, my alma mater. So thank you for what you do.
Teal, thank you very, very much. Does anybody here doubt the capabilities, skill sets, or potential of our students? That was very, very impressive. Very proud to have you here. It's always a pleasure, and I've had this pleasure, a couple of times before, to introduce a very, very esteemed faculty member, Professor Robert Reich. And I think we're all very, very lucky to have him here with us again. As many of you know, Bob served in 3 administrations, most recently as Secretary of Labor under President Clinton, and most recently he served on the transition team for President Obama. He's written 13 books, including The Work of Nations, and that's been, believe it or not, translated into some 22 languages, and a number of other bestsellers as well, some of which include The Future of Success, Locked in the Cabinet, and his most recent book, Aftershock, The Next Economy in America's Future, which has had rave reviews. Bob is co-founding editor of the American Prospect magazine. His commentaries are heard weekly on public radio's Marketplace. Going back a few years, in 2003, he was awarded the prestigious Václav Havel Vision Foundation Prize by the former Czech president, and this was for his pioneering work in economic and social thought. In 2008, Time magazine named him one of the century's 10 most successful cabinet secretaries. And the Wall Street Journal in 2008 as well, in their rankings of the influential business thinkers, put him in the top 10. Here at Berkeley, over 750 students enroll in his undergraduate class, which is called Wealth and Poverty. And in his graduate classes, they're consistently filled to capacity. He's probably the most sought-after speaker on campus, and through his talks and appearances, he clearly bridges the world of government, media, business, and academia as no other public intellectual, has done. He received his BA from Dartmouth, his MA from Oxford, and where he was also a Rhodes Scholar, and his law degree, his JD, from the Yale Law School. It's truly a pleasure to have you with us once again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Those of you who cannot, please put up your hand. Can you hear? No. All right. How's that? It doesn't matter. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to also thank our dean, Henry Brady, for his energy and his enthusiasm and his infectious sense that he has given the faculty of what we need to do and how we need to do it, and I can't describe to you. Being in a meeting, a faculty meeting with Henry, is like being at a pep rally. But it's better than that because there's content to it as well. The only thing that I can possibly say, in order to make this a realistic assessment of Henry, I really do need to give at least one negative. I remember years ago, I was working in the campaign of Michael Dukakis, and there was a news person interviewing me, among many others, wanted to know how Michael Dukakis would be as a president, what his advantages, what the positives were, and I spent most of the interview talking about the positives, and this news person said, this media person said, in order to be credible, for anything you've said so far, you've got to give us at least one qualification, something that he's not all that great at. And I gave that one qualification about Michael Dukakis, and that was the only thing that made the evening news. So I'm going to give that one qualification about Henry Brady, and this is what will make the evening news. He's too big. Now, let me be more specific about this. Henry has too large a carbon footprint. And I've studied this a little bit. I exhale in 3 days the amount of CO2 that Henry exhales in just one. So I don't know what to do about it. I think that if we do have, Henry, kind of an exchange system with regard to, if we do get finally a cap and trade system, you're going to owe me a lot. So thanks also to Teal Brown. And Teal, you did where are you? You did a splendid job tonight. Absolutely splendid. And while I was watching and listening to you, I could not help but think back 42 years. Now, you're not 42 years, but I was thinking back 42 years at when I was campaigning for Eugene McCarthy, and your parents and I met. And they are just as dynamic as you are. They're older, but... and you got into our Goldman School not because of any strings. I didn't even know you were coming until you arrived. And you've been wonderful as a student and as a research assistant, so thank you for everything you've done. I want to... yes, you can applaud. John Gage also knows your parents. Charles Frankel said to me during dinner, he said, "I hope you're going to be upbeat tonight." Which put me in a terrible fix, because I was not planning on being upbeat, and all through dinner I thought, how can I possibly be upbeat? And what am I going to be upbeat about? So Charles, I'm going to do my best. I've just finished a book tour. Book tours, by the way, I don't know how many of you have gone on a book tour or written a book. They are terrible things. They are really terrible things. A few years ago, I was on a book tour, and I found myself in Michigan in a window of a bookstore. No, they actually put me into the window. This is honest. They put me in a window with a sign that said, Robert Reich will sign his latest book. And there was a light on me in the window of this bookstore, and nobody came in. But people passed on the street, and I waved, and they looked at me. It was something like, I felt like one of those ladies in Amsterdam, you know. But at least they had customers. But this was better. This was about a new book that I will tell you about very briefly, because I want to save time for your questions, if you have them. It's called Aftershock. Jim mentioned it. And I wrote it, many of my books are the kind of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up. They really... But this book has done better than normally. And it is a serious book, and it's not downbeat, Charles. Really, seriously, it's not. It has a very upbeat ending. So you have to read the whole thing in order to get to the upbeat part. Essentially, there's an economic part and a political part. And I tend to write and research in the area of the relationship and the interstices between politics and economics, partly because I see a lot of it and have done a lot of it in my life, and partly because, as many of you know, before Alfred Marshall wrote his wonderful, famous Principles of Economics in 1890, there was no separate discipline called economics. It was political economy. In fact, if you go down behind another century, to the 18th century, it wasn't just political economy, it was moral philosophy. Adam Smith called himself not an economist, not even a political economist, but a moral philosopher. And the point is that you can't really separate politics from economics from ethics. And I think one thing that we try to do in our classes, regardless of what we teach, and some of you are my colleagues out there, and you know this, and we talk about it all the time, is we try to teach across disciplines. Because we want our students to understand the relationships between leadership and policy and analysis and economics and ethics, if they're going to be leaders in the future. The economic part of my book is as such. I start with the simple reality, which is quite, Charles, downbeat, that in 2007, the median wage of the typical male worker in the United States was, adjusted for inflation, no higher than was the median male wage 3 decades before. Now, then I asked this very, very obvious question: how is it that families continue to spend? I mean, American consumers have been the energizer bunnies of the global economy for at least 30 years. And they did that by utilizing what I call 3 coping mechanisms. First, women went into paid work in large numbers. I wish I could say that was because of great new professional opportunities opening for women. That's not why most women went into the workforce in huge numbers, particularly women who were mothers of young children, beginning in the late 70s. It was because they wanted to and needed to prop up family incomes. And when that coping mechanism was exhausted, because there is only a certain amount and number and percentage of women of young children that can be in the workforce, then families turned to working longer hours. And when I was Secretary of Labor, I remember looking over the data and seeing that the typical worker in the United States, even by the mid-90s, was working 350 hours longer than the typical worker in Europe, even longer than the typical worker in Japan. And then the third coping strategy, when that was exhausted, was going deeper and deeper into debt, which was possible because housing prices were going up and you could refinance your homes or use your home as collateral in terms of home equity loans. But then, of course, we had the bubble bursting. The mortgage bubble, the housing bubble burst, and that meant that the coping mechanisms were over. There was no longer the capacity in the middle class to continue to spend as they were spending. Now, I say this as background. Right after President Obama was elected, he had a meeting of the people who had been advising him during his campaign. And we sat around a table, and I remember in Chicago, he came into the room. This is a man who had just been elected president. And he's the first black president we have had, and I was quite seriously overcome. He came up to the table, we were all sitting, he shook our hands, and I was in tears. And all I managed to say was, "Thank God," and said nothing else. But Paul Volcker was there at that table. Now, Paul Volcker is very tall. Awkwardly so. And the conversation was, well, what's going on with this economy? Now, this was in 2008, the end of 2008, after November, just, in fact, 2 days after Election Day 2008. And we all knew that something terribly violent, a convulsion has happened. Most of the press had focused on Wall Street, and obviously that was the proximate cause of all of this. Paul Volcker, though, said something when it came his turn to speak, which I thought was not only important, but profoundly wrong. He said, the fundamental problem, Mr. President, is not Wall Street. Wall Street simply represents the manifestation of a more fundamental problem, and that is that Americans have spent beyond their means, and we are now facing a day of reckoning. Now, I thought that this was wrong. I mean, yes, Americans had spent beyond their means, but there was, knowing that the median wage for men had not grown at all, even though the American economy had expanded, it seemed to me he was missing something. And I was just about to say something when Laura Tyson, my colleague here at Berkeley, Department of Economics, former CEA chairman, she piped up and she said, "Paul, I think you're wrong." And the president said, "Well, why, Laura, do you think Paul is wrong?" And Laura said, "It's not that Americans have spent beyond their means. The fundamental problem is their means have not grown." And I could have come over and kissed Laura because she said it exactly the way I was seeing it after the research that I've been doing. In the preparation for this book, by the way, I also came across a man named Mariner Eccles. Interesting man. His name is on the Federal Reserve Building in Washington. It is the Mariner Eccles Building. Mariner Eccles was Federal Reserve Chair from 1934 to 1948. But what is interesting for the purposes of understanding the Great Recession is that Mariner Eccles, after studying and being part of an administration that dealt with the Great Depression, wrote a book that I think almost nobody read. Fewer people read this book than read my books. And Mariner Eccles' book, which I did read, blamed the Great Depression on the fact that by the late 1920s, a huge amount of the nation's income had concentrated at the very top. The median wage had barely grown at all. The only way that Americans had kept spending, said Mariner Eccles, was by going deeper and deeper into debt. And finally, said Mariner Eccles, that debt bubble burst, and it was impossible to continue to maintain the aggregate demand that was necessary to generate economic growth and employment. What's interesting about that is that one of our colleagues here at Berkeley, Emmanuel Says, has done a series of studies on income inequality in the United States, looking at tax returns. And Emmanuel Says has found that in 2007, the top 1% of Americans by income were taking home 23.5% of total national income. Now that was the highest percentage we've seen since, wait for it, the year 1928. In fact, 1928 and 2007 both represented and have represented the peak years in terms of concentrated income in the United States. What happened in 1929, we understand. What happened in 2008, we have still only a vague notion, but it may have something to do with the same thing that Mariner Eccles saw. That is, when income becomes too concentrated, the vast middle class doesn't have the purchasing power to continue to buy the goods and services that the economy is capable of producing at full employment. In other words, getting back to the Obama administration, we may have learned one very important lesson from the Great Depression and not learned the second. The one very important lesson we learned from the Great Depression was when you are on the brink of financial Armageddon, a financial catastrophe, what you need to do is flood the economy with money. That's what we did with the bailout. That's what we did with the stimulus package. That's what the Federal Reserve Board has done with regard to quantitative easing and keeping interest rates very low. But we did not learn the second lesson, which was a lesson, ironically, that Franklin D. Roosevelt did learn and didn't understand the first one. And the second lesson is that when the distribution of income becomes overwhelmingly concentrated, you've got to take steps to reorganize your society, restructure your society, so that there is a wider sharing of the benefits of economic growth. Otherwise, you are going to lurch from boom to bust. You are not going to have the aggregate demand in the economy you need. Now, I told you initially that my book is partly economic and partly political, but the big uplifting part of it, Charles, I haven't yet got to, and now I'm going to get to, and that is the political part of it. Because my thesis is that when you have a middle class that for years is suffering and is likely to continue to suffer high unemployment and stagnant wages, you get a degree of economic insecurity and frustration that invites a certain kind of angry politics. A politics that is not really a constructive politics, but it's a politics that is jingoistic, nativist. A politics that is isolationist and also looking very much for scapegoats. Immigrants, China, gays, the rich, international bankers, and so forth. In other words, the kind of politics that we are seeing growing in America. I was on a television program not long ago, and during the station break, I was debating with somebody else, a Republican, a policy analyst, and during the station break, the producer, who was hooked up to my ear, a little earbud, said, "Be angrier." I said, "What do you mean, be angrier?" And she said, "You've got to be angrier because people are surfing through the television channels and they stop when they see a good fight. And your conversation is fine, but we want you to be angrier." And I said, "I don't want to be angrier. I thought the conversation was quite good and quite constructive." She said, "We need you to be angrier." And at that point, I lost my temper. But you see, what we see on television mirrors the degree of anger and frustration that is there in the population right now. I was talking with a few of you before dinner who were telling me the anger that you have seen out there. I have gone around the country on this book tour, and I kept on bumping into it. More anger than I have ever seen. Again, I think very closely related to economic insecurity. Which finally brings me, Charles, to my upbeat message. And that is this. I think we face a choice. I don't think this economy is going to get much better. Yes, the stock market is doing fine. That's largely because big companies are selling abroad and making profits that way, and they are also substituting automation and technology for labor, and they're getting their costs down, and that's all fine. But in terms of Main Street, that doesn't help. In fact, Main Street is just as bad, almost, as it was. The choice ahead is either learning the lesson that we did not learn from the Great Depression and taking steps that do widen the circle of prosperity, or watching the nation move and witnessing and participating indirectly in a move toward a much more regressive and reactionary politics. Here's why I believe we will choose reform rather than reaction. I believe this because we are very sensible people. When we get with our backs up to the wall, we put ideology aside. It has happened again and again and again. We roll up our sleeves and we do what has to be done. The top 1% will understand, I am absolutely convinced, that they will do better with a smaller percentage of a rapidly growing economy and an economy that is generating a positive politics than they will with a much larger share of an economy that is basically anemic and that's generating a very negative politics. In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is it's not a zero-sum game and it's not redistributionist. It is a positive-sum game in which people at the top will understand what we as a country came to understand in the post-war 3 decades, 1945 to 1975, when everybody rose together, when we had extraordinary prosperity. And that is exactly as John F. Kennedy put it, a rising tide lifts all boats. So, Charles, that's my positive message to you. It's not going to happen right away. This Congress, I think, is going to be very difficult. And I was out trying to support some candidates months ago, and it was hard. It was hard work. The forces of reaction are very, very strong out there right now, but they will not prevail. And on that note, I want to open it up to your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Yes.
Why have progressive taxes on the ultra-rich not had more traction in the current debate? There's been talk about real advantages to taxing the ultra rich, and yet the debate seems to focus on the injustice to those who are earning $250,000 a year.
Yeah.
Why is
Well,
that?
it's an interesting question. I think we, in this country, have got hung up on marginal tax rates that really belong to a very different kind of distribution of income. John Cassidy in the New Yorker had an interesting piece on this several months ago. It is no longer the case that inequality is measured primarily by comparing the top 10% or the top 20% to the bottom 10% or the bottom 20%. The real chasm in America right now is between the top 1% and everybody else, or the top 1/10 of 1% and everyone else. And so you are suggesting something that I think public policymakers are going to be slowly understanding as well, and that is we may have to think about a different way of arranging marginal taxes that acknowledges and responds to this degree of concentration.
And then why the slowness? Why has it not taken hold as an issue at this time when you would think that it would resolve many of the tensions?
Well, here is where I want to risk dipping a little bit into a downbeat note, which ultimately has an upbeat end to it. But I want to just say, you've got several forces right now, a huge amount of money going into political races. I mean, much larger proportionally than we've ever seen before, adjusted for inflation. Secondly, a lot of that money is going in now in secret. After the Citizens United case, it's a completely different ballgame in terms of raising money in American politics. Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission, I think, ranks and will historically rank as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history. Right up there. Right up there with Bush against Gore, or Dred Scott. I mean, it's really that bad. If you read Justice Stevens' dissent in Citizens United, which I really do commend to every one of you. It's a beautiful reading, but it's also absolutely razor-sharp logic. You can't help but walk away and think that was a fundamentally not just a bad decision, but a decision that had ulterior motives. So you get the combination of a huge amount of money and Citizens United and the secrecy. Right now, Congress has before it something called the Disclose Act, which will require that all political contributions and all donations, consistent with Citizens United, and by the way, Citizens United did not condone secrecy. In fact, Citizens United assumed that there would be full disclosure of campaign donations. The Disclose Act requires full disclosure. The chances that Congress will actually enact it in the 2.5 weeks remaining of the lame duck session, I think, are very, very small. But it's very important. But that combination that I just suggested to you is pernicious. And I think it does help explain why the public doesn't even know much of what's going on in terms of the concentration of wealth and income, for example. Steve. That is the most left-wing radical statement I think I've ever heard, and I'm not going to even repeat it. But generally, it's a stylized version of what I did say. That is, if you restructure the economy, as Franklin D. Roosevelt did, in terms of the Wagner Act permitting labor unions, minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, a lot of things that we take for granted, which actually had the effect of a 40-hour work week, with time and a half for overtime. All of this had the effect of restructuring the economy and generating a wider sharing of the gains of economic growth. And that, particularly after World War II, set us up for a period of extraordinary prosperity, shared prosperity, because there was enough aggregate demand to buy all of the things that a mass production-based economy at almost full employment could produce. And that, in turn, Steve, and I think you're saying this, what you're getting at, is that created a virtuous cycle. The rich got richer, everybody got richer. Incomes over that 3 decades doubled for everybody. Inequality actually shrank in this country. And we found, we thought, the model of democratic capitalism that was going to be a model to the world. And much of the world did think that. Then something happened. And we don't have the time to talk about what happened, some of it economic, some of it political. If I gave it away here, nobody would have any incentive to go and buy my book. Other questions? Yes, Bob.
Are there regional variations in the wealth distribution? Because there's very large differences in unemployment in different states.
There are some regional variations, but they're not very pronounced. Most of the differences in unemployment have to do with education levels. That is, right now, although the national unemployment rate, for all its faults, it understates the true nature of unemployment because it doesn't pick up a lot of people who are too discouraged to look for work or people who are working part-time, you'd rather be working full-time. But that 9.6% really also importantly masks the extent to which education and educational level correlate with unemployment. If you have a college degree, the unemployment rate among people with college degrees is 5%. If you are a high school dropout, the unemployment rate is higher than 20%. And that's another reason that many people in the Washington-New York corridor, or the so-called, the high-income corridor, or the people who occupy the corridors of Washington power or executive power, don't understand the extent of the anger out there and the exasperation and desperation because it's so correlated with income. And most of the people we talk to are doing okay. Michael.
So this is obviously a sneaky trick to try to connect your interest to my interest. If we get on top of the climate change challenge, we're going to have to do several different things, one of which has to be an economy based on less stuff. And you were talking about the aggregate demand for things that blue-collar workers make. But if the economy of the future has less stuff, and I mean things like cars, houses, furniture in the houses, what does that imply for your recipe of climbing out of our hole?
Well, it doesn't imply all of that much. That is, you can have high aggregate demand for public goods as well. Public parks, public health, public transportation. You would have to convince the public that the public sector could do that and public goods were that important. But indeed, I think that is part of the transformation we have to make and will make. What I recommend in the book, for example, which is now controversial and I don't think it should be, is a carbon tax. A carbon tax would presumably not only move us toward more innovation with regard to non-carbon-based energy production, but also would create incentives for people, households, to utilize public goods and demand public goods to a larger extent than private goods that are very energy intensive. So every one of these pieces does fit together. Yes?
You had an interesting blog recently about Sarah Palin and talking about her presidential ambitions, possibility of being a third-party candidate and the like. In that, I don't believe that you speculated about who the Republican nominee might be. And the question is, do you think there is a real chance that Palin would be a third-party candidate?
Yeah, and Charles, there's another aspect of my upbeat message. because I think that, I was talking last week in Washington to an influential Republican opinion leader, as they're called, who said in a very dismissive way, Sarah Palin doesn't have a chance. She's not really interested in being president. She's not doing what you have to do to get the GOP nomination, which is to play the inside game and talk to all the kingmakers inside the Republican Party. She has to mend all the fences that she really did tear down with her support for Tea Party candidates. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's just out for celebrity. That was what this Republican told me. I think he is wrong. I think he doesn't understand the game she's playing. She's not playing the insider GOP game. She's playing an outsider game, which is built on the anger of the white working class in America. I don't know how many of you watched Bristol Palin. How many of you watched Bristol Palin on Dancing with the Stars? There are 5 of you in this room that watched Bristol Palin, including Teal Brown. And I'm going to tell your parents, Teal. But the point I want to make is that that was one of the most popular programs in recent American history. Something like 22 million people watched that. You guys are so out of touch. But here's why I raised that. Because this all comes in 1 week. Sarah Palin has a cover story on the New York Times Magazine, and then she launches her second book with the first printing of 1 million copies, and then she has a 6-part cable program on Alaska and America in Alaska, and then her daughter is on Dancing with the Stars and comes in 3rd or something like that. This is not an inside Republican strategy. This is a strategy that says to the white working class, I am with you, and we are going to essentially take over from the intellectual and cultural elites that have been governing this country and are responsible for where you are right now. She's going to go to the Republican Party. Now, I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm right. She's going to go to the Republican Party over the next year or 15 months, 16 months. She's going to say, if you deny me the nomination, I'm going to run as an independent. And that will bring her down, and it will bring down the Republican in 2012. That's okay. That's part of her strategy, because she's going to run again in 2016, and she's going to say the same thing, but she'll have more credibility in 2016. And unless the economy improves dramatically for average working people between now and 2016, she's got a greater chance. And she's betting that it won't. Feel better, Charles? Yes. There's some very attractive aspects of the Domenici-Rivlin plan, and there are also some very attractive aspects of the Erskine-Bowles-Alan Simpson plan. And hopefully it will stir a national debate and maybe a very positive debate about how we handle the long-term budget deficit. One thing that concerns me, however, is that these reports and these plans are so much all over the map that they are distracting attention from the number one driver of the long-term deficit, which is healthcare costs. They're going up and continue and projected to soar over the next 15 years, combined with baby boomers whose bodies, 77 million of them, are going to be corroding over the next 20 to 30 years. And that you put that combination together, and that explains 75 to 80% of the long-term budget deficit problem, because that's what's driving Medicare. And Medicare is the problem. Social Security is not the problem. Social Security can be remedied by relatively small changes, and the only reason Social Security is a problem at all, given our conversation so far tonight, is because when the projections were made in the 80s under the Greenspan Commission and then the 90s when I was a trustee of the Social Security Commission, we did not know the extent to which income was going to become so concentrated at the top. And so the Social Security cutoff with regard to the percentage of income subject to Social Security was designed at a time when income was not nearly that concentrated. Even though it does go up with inflation, it still does not take that degree of concentration into account. And so there are a lot of things that can be done. We can raise the retirement age, we can raise the cap on the portion of income subjected to Social Security, which would be the logical thing to do. That's not the problem. The problem is Medicare, but it's not just Medicare, it's the health care costs that are rising behind Medicare. And all of these reports are fine, but they're taking our eyes off that ball. That's what I worry about. Yes?
All of your examples about post-depression focused on the ability of us working people to manufacture and make things and have jobs that made things. How do you recreate that when we don't make anything anymore?
Well, the verb to make is a loaded verb because most stuff that is physical that we buy, the actual physical aspects of what we buy are the smallest value added in what we buy. Most of the value added comes in engineering and design engineering, manufacturing engineering, system integration, distribution, marketing, advertising, finance and legal services. It's on and on and on. They are classified, most of them, as services, but that's the value. I mean, this cell phone in my pocket, which is a very archaic form of cell phone, it's not an iPhone, it's just a simple cell phone. Most of this is not the value that what I paid for is not the physical manifestation of this. And people who want to go back to a manufacturing economy are not focusing on a second fact, and that is that manufacturing today is not nearly as labor intensive as the old assembly lines. I was visiting a manufacturing facility not that long ago in the Midwest, and I went in, and it was mostly numerically controlled machine tools and robotics, and only 10 or 15 people sitting behind computers controlling all of them. It's a different world. We can't go back there. Well, the transition is really a transition over the long term to a higher educated workforce capable of solving and identifying new problems, of being more creative, of doing the kind of advanced service work that we need in the globe. Doesn't mean everybody has to do that, but a larger portion of us have to be doing that. The rest of the jobs will inevitably be in the local service economy. The retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, all of the things that require personal attention, childcare, elder care. I mean, there's going to be a lot of that. But my point is that unless we have a critical percentage of our population, much larger than now, capable of doing the complicated engineering, design, creative work that the new economy, global economy, is paying for, all our standard of living just will not be able to hold. Yes?
The examples of rejuvenation throughout American history. So I'm always amazed about the Jamestown colony, for example, where you'd be born to two biological parents, and then your mother would die to malaria, and your father would remarry, and then your father would die, and your stepmother would remarry. And most people would graduate into adulthood with parents who weren't their biological parents, and yet that colony was able to thrive in really remarkable ways. And I think about your point, like if you were to sort of focus on what are those key factors that allow sort of for that rejuvenation? You might think in the 20th century about the muckraking journalists in the turn of the century and maybe the unions in the 30s, but what's the new progressive era? What's the outline of that? What's the moving force behind it?
I don't know.
Thank you.
No, one thing that I love about teaching at the Goldman School is that there are so many students, as Teal said, who embody so much enthusiasm and so much energy and so much originality and creativity in terms of tackling the problems of the world. If I were going to ask myself, what is it that is the new model? I can't tell what it is, I can't describe it to you, but I know it's there and it's among these young people. And that's what gives me great confidence, honestly.
You mentioned a few of the public policy initiatives in the 1930s that you credited with a great deal of success later. And so I was wondering, beyond carbon tax, what the recommendations are for public policy for now.
Well, I kind of divide the world of public policy and the kind of next economy into two pieces. One has to do with the short term. How do we, in the relatively short term, ensure that there's enough aggregate demand in our society that in turn will generate jobs? We can't just give money willy-nilly to people. But what can we do to, perhaps through expanding the Earned Income Tax Code, credit, rather, making it move right all the way through into the middle class, maybe exempting the first $20,000 of income from the payroll tax, making it up by applying the payroll tax to much higher incomes. There are a whole variety of things that could be done that would, in the short term, put more money into people's pockets and generate, therefore, through a multiplier effect, more economic activity, growth, and jobs. But then we get to the longer term, which is in some sense much more important. And I keep on coming back to the theme we were just talking about, and that is education. We know, for example, that early childhood education works. Very rarely in social science literature do we have so much evidence pointing to the success and importance of particular initiatives in terms of the return to public investment as we do with early childhood education. For example, we also know something, although less, about K through 12 education, about how to make it work, what's working and what's not working. And finally, the thing that is most distressing to me is that we know that more and more of our young people who are qualified need to be able to afford a college degree when in fact we're heading in exactly the opposite direction as fast as we possibly can. The University of California, Berkeley is still the best public university in America, probably the world. But what is happening to it is an example of us as Californians and as Americans collectively shooting ourselves in the feet. It is insane. It is irrational. And to a smaller degree, but no less, metaphorically, the Goldman School is a jewel, a crown jewel, and needs many, many more resources. So I ask all of you, this is what I was really building up toward. When you do get the extension of the Bush tax cut, take that extension of the Bush tax cut and turn it around and give it to Henry. Thank you very much.
That's terrific. Professor Reich, thank you once again for sharing your incisive considerations. Your knowledge, your humor is just always a delight, and I think the last recommendation is one everybody should bear in mind. But hearing from faculty like Bob, makes it not very difficult to understand why we are continually rated as the top public policy school and why our students go on to pretty impressive things. Earlier today, Dean Brady spoke to us, gave us, I think, a real eye-opening discourse on not only the evaluation that we'd received, but the challenges, the opportunities that we have for the school. And as I subsequently asked the board, please, get engaged, get more involved in the school. There's so much more that we can do together. And I would ask you all the very same thing, pretty much as Bob did, though not quite so explicitly. And that is, please get engaged. You probably showed up here tonight for a reason. I mean, obviously, it's always very, very fun to hear Bob, to hear our students, and the like. But I think the more you're engaged, the more you and future generations will really benefit. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.